All right. What do you call a deer with no eyes? No eye deer. What do you call a deer with no eyes and no legs? Still no eye deer. You remember this one? What did the hippie say when I told him to get off my couch? Namaste.
Oof.
All right.
Fucking dead air on that one. That's great. You know, it's funny. That hippie, he died later. He drowned. You want to know how?
God damn it.
He was too far out, man. Okay, I'm done.
I died on the inside.
As you should.
Mm-hmm.
I'm even more satisfied by the dead silence after the punchline than it would be if you actually laughed at it.
All right, well, let's jump into this then. Hopefully, I'll keep this a little shorter, since these chapters of Capital definitely flow much more smoothly than the last couple. All right, so so the general formula of Capital is chapter 4. So Mark's already we already introduced CMC, which is the circulation of commodities, and the shorthand name for that, selling in order to buy. Right, so if you have a commodity, you're selling it for money, and then you take that money and you go buy a different commodity. Pretty straightforward. And this chain kind of just continues indefinitely as money circulates through the economy and people sell stuff and then buy stuff again. And the general purpose of that is to exchange use values. So specifically, the commodity you start with, the C to M transformation, that initial commodity you have is not very useful to you. I don't need it. I don't want it. So I'm going to go sell it for money. Now, money being the universal equivalent is very handy to have instead of that useless commodity because I can exchange it for a different commodity that I do have a use for, a need for. So that could be like the means of subsistence. So that's like food, shelter, water, all that fun stuff, medicine. Or it could be a luxury good, whatever. And by the way, we'll kind of come back around to this later, but this is the more common circuit for the average worker, right? So any of us that are going into work each day are selling the only commodity we have to sell, which is our labor power. Like I said, we'll kind of come back around to this in chapter 6 later on. But we're selling our labor power to the capitalist, and the capitalist gives us money in the form of wages. And then we take that money and we go to the store and we buy stuff to keep ourselves alive. So this circuit is mainly for workers who are, buying stuff in order to consume it and to keep themselves going. And the opposite is MCM, which I think, it was introduced at the end of chapter 3, but now we're going to take a little bit, closer look at it. So now we are. Oh, you're right. I was right on it. Okay, I knew I was close to it. So this is someone who starts with some money. They go and buy a commodity in the market, and then they take that commodity and sell it again for money. Now, what he initially points out, a couple paragraphs on how, M to C and C to M in both circuits are basically the same thing, especially if you... And the only thing that makes it different is because they're viewed from different perspectives. So MC is what he calls the purchase, where the money becomes a commodity, and the other one is called the sale, just commodity into money. But really, in a very Marxian dialectical way, he's basically saying, well, they're kind of the same thing, just it basically just changes on what is your particular perspective. Are you the buyer or are you the seller? Ultimately, the act is the same regardless. We just have different names for it depending on which end. Are you receiving the commodity or receiving the money? So anyways, he says the result in which the whole process vanishes is the exchange of money for money. This is talking about MCM. Which is weird, right? Because at least with CMC, if you start with one commodity, you get your universal equivalent money, and you get a different commodity. At least at the end of that, you come out with a different use value. You start with something you didn't have a use for, and you end with something you do have a use for. Great. That's it's going to help me do whatever I need to do. But MCM seems kind of useless if if I start with 100 and then get 100 back. Right, so he says, if ultimately, well, here, I'll just read this. Now, it is evident that if the circulatory process would be, MCM, would be absurd and empty if the intention were, by using this roundabout route, to exchange two equal sums of money, £100 for £100. Right, so if the value of M and or M1 and M2, if you want to call them that, if they're equal, then what the hell? That was not very useful, and he kind of compares a capitalist to a miser, someone who hoards money and stuff. You'd be much safer off just hoarding $100 and not threatening it potentially in circulation. At some point, you're going to want to get more money. Let's start here. The process MCM does not therefore owe its content any qualitative difference between its extremes, for they are both money. So I'll stop right there for real quick. Like I just mentioned, if you do the CMC, you are changing. You start with a commodity and you end up with a commodity, but they're very qualitatively different because they have different use values. Whereas MCM is not qualitatively different because they're both money, but they are quantitatively different. So to continue, he says, but solely to quantitative changes. More money is finally withdrawn from the circulation that was thrown into it at the beginning. The cotton originally bought for £100, for example, resold at 100 plus 10, 110 pounds. The complete form of this process is therefore MCM prime, where M prime is M plus delta M, which is the original sum advanced plus an increment. This increment over excess, or excess over the original value, he calls surplus value. So, indeed, you wouldn't go £100 for £100. That's goofy. The objective of doing this circuit in the first place is to acquire M prime, which is M plus delta M, or an increment in your money, hopefully upwards and not downwards. And for anyone who's maybe not familiar with just basic mathematics language, capital delta symbol means change. And so this is basically change in the value of M. Right, so M plus a change in M. That is what this symbol means. That's all. And now specifically, the delta M portion of this, the increment or excess over the original, that is what we call surplus value. And that is Marx is introducing the first, well, I should say the first 3 chapters. He was putting all kinds of puzzle pieces on the board, but this is one of the important puzzle pieces. And it's also going to represent sort of one of the core parts of the problem statement for capital. Like, what is the problem that Marx is trying to solve, and we're going to be learning about how he's arguing for a solution. Now, the crux of the question then is, where does delta M come from? Where does the surplus value come from? And we're getting a clue early on that it has something to do with the circulation of commodities, with this MCM prime business going on. But we're going to get a little more into that later. Okay. Let's see. Let's keep going here. Okay, so this is more... Oh yeah, when does he... Oh, okay, yeah. I didn't want to go too far. So, continuing off the surplus value the bit there, he says the value originally advanced, therefore, not only remains intact while in circulation, but increases its magnitude, adds to itself a surplus value, or is valorized. So, another important definition for us as we continue on here is valorizing, or valorized. Basically, yeah, if you see this word, some version of it, just have this in your mind, that if you have M plus delta M, that process of a magnitude of money adding surplus value to itself is called valorization. And he says right after this, another very important little definition for us to put in our pocket, is that this movement converts it into capital. So we're getting some building blocks put together here, where the thing that makes money capital is that it is a value that is thrown into circulation, but that its magnitude increases due to the addition of some surplus value. And that is what makes money capital versus just regular old money. Now, regular old money is more common in the CMC. That's basically how you or I use money, because we get paid with money, and then we go to the store and we spend it, or we spend it on rent or whatever. We are not throwing money into the market in order to make more money. We are just spending it to get something we need to use right away, for the most part. So that's a big difference. Yeah, go ahead.
This is where we get the saying, or rather, where the saying "capital is value in motion" comes from.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. So we know it has to be money that is in circulation. Although we'll kind of pretty soon, when we jump into chapter 5, we'll see that that's not. While that is a necessary condition, it is not sufficient. Right? There's a little more going on than just being in circulation. And then the other thing is that it's increasing magnitude, and we'll get into that too. So, let's see. Let's jump ahead a little bit here. So he says, certainly M becomes M plus delta M, which is another way of saying 100 becomes 110. But considered qualitatively, 100 pounds is still the same as 110. Namely, they're both money. While from the quantitative point of view, 110 is like 100, a sum of definite and limited value. If the 110 is now spent as money, it ceases to play its part. It is no longer capital. Withdrawn from circulation, highlight that fast. Withdrawn from circulation, it is petrified into a hoard, and it could remain in that position until the last judgment without a single farthing accruing to it. If then we are concerned with the valorization, there's that word again, of value, the value of the 110 has the same need for valorization as the value of the 100. They are both limited expressions of exchange value. Therefore, both have the same vocation to approach a quantitative increase as near as possible to absolute wealth. Momentarily, indeed, the value originally advanced, the £100, is distinguishable from the surplus value of £10 added to it during circulation. But the distinction vanishes immediately at the end of the process. And at the end of the process, we do not receive, on the one hand, our original £100. This PDF got cut off a little bit. I think it basically says that it emerges rather as 110. So this is a roundabout way of saying that the MCM circuit can either terminate. So you could go, for example, MC M prime C, which would be another way. Now, I guess M prime could be a horde, right? So he says one possibility is that you make M plus delta M, which is another way of saying M prime. If you make this money, you could just stop and just put it in a horde and be content. That means it would be it's no longer capital. The other thing he says that could happen with it, he says if it's spent as money, it's also no longer capital. So that would be basically going MCM prime C. So you start with £100, buy something, you sell it again for 110, and then you spend the 110 on a commodity and you're done. You go home. The circuit is terminated. You spent your money. It's just money. It's no longer even capital. And that's the end of the story. So what makes it distinct as capital is the continuous motion. And I know this is cut off, but let me find it really quickly and read the end of that paragraph. Okay. It's somewhere. It's going to start right here. I know it's cut off, but here's what it says. The simple circulation of commodities, selling in order to buy, that's the CMC, is a means to a final goal which lies outside circulation, namely the appropriation of use values, which is the satisfaction of needs. As against this, the circulation of money as capital is an end in itself, for the valorization of value takes place only within this constantly renewed movement. The movement of capital is therefore limitless. So here's a big difference between our two circuits. The CMC circuit, which he calls the simple circulation of commodities, always has a termination point. It terminates when you get a use value and then you use it. It's pretty straightforward. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, quite literally. But MCM, and then you can kind of extend that out by saying MCM prime, CM prime prime, CM prime prime prime, so on and so forth. That circuit can just keep going, right? You make £10, then you take it back to the market. You make another £10, go back to the market. Blah, this process of accumulating capital always renews itself, and he says that makes it limitless. Now, money, and remember, capital. We'll have to, obviously, we'll get more into capital. That's the name of the damn book. But capital can be used as money, of course. But I wanted to also quickly call out, and I know this is in the David Hardy video, but he harkens back to one of the earlier chapters we were on, and how money is a social power, right? So because it is this universal equivalent that allows access to all kinds of use values, the limitless accumulation of capital also means the limitless accumulation of social power. So keep that in the back of your mind as we continue here, because that has some ramifications. I'm sure you can imagine. All right, so I think that's pretty good for this chapter. There's a little bit of a conclusion here, kind of going over it, and we'll do this for the conclusion real fast. So he says, buying in order to sell, or more accurately, buying in order to sell dearer, which is MCM, seems admittedly to be a form peculiar to one kind of capital alone, which is merchant's capital. But industrial capital, too, is money which has been changed into commodities and reconverted into more money by the sale of those commodities. Events which take place outside the sphere of circulation and in the interval between buying and selling do not affect the form of this movement. And lastly, in the case of interest-bearing capital, the circulation MCM prime presents itself in an abridged form. In its final result, and without any intermediate stage, in a concise style, so to speak, as M to M prime, money which is worth more money, value which is greater than itself. MCM prime is in fact therefore the general formula for capital, in the form in which it appears directly in the sphere of circulation. So there's the title of the chapter, right? The general formula. It's MCM prime. And good.
I was just gonna say, I feel like Marx, I love you, bro, but that Marx on Capital is a Real God essay with the whole like control loop diagram and that whole section of that essay, that puts this into so much easier language.
I think I don't know, personally I find both things easy to understand.
I understand it, but at the same time but at the same time I'm thinking about this from like the layman's perspective and thinking like, God, the normal person reading this, their eyes are just fucking glazing over right now.
Yeah, it is kind of dry. But personally, I think if he didn't use the symbology, it would be almost impossible. Right? Because imagine he just kept using like buy, sell, buy, sell, buy, sell. You'd just be like, oh my god.
He was speaking to the audience of his day and trying to convince a bunch of other like stuffy academics. So he had to portray it in these terms. But it just this just got me thinking about the contrast between how it was described in that essay and how it's described here, and I'm just like, dude, you need to be a better writer.
You do get a little bit of that symbolic language back on 255, where he talks about the occultability of value to add value to itself, or capital to add value to itself, and bringing forth living offspring or laying golden eggs. I kind of liked that. It was kind of one of those, it's like, okay, that gives a good visual and also a little bit of a chuckle.
Yeah, see, no, like allegory and stuff like that, that's fine, but like the rest of this is just like, if I weren't already so math brained, I would be listening to this and just being like, what the fuck?
I know why so many economists haven't even read this.
Yeah. Well, there's also, like, I remember learning the rule of thumb as, like, a child, right? The whole, you need money to make money. That was, like, one of the earliest lessons, I think, I was taught that had anything to do with economics. I want to say my dad taught me that when I was putting together an orange juice stand when I was a kid in Florida. Because I would go around the neighborhood stealing all my neighbors' oranges, making orange juice, and then selling it back to them.
Truly, you were in the capitalist grind set even as a child.
I was, yes. Including the appropriation of products that were not mine.
Using means of production.
I was referring to primitive capital accumulation. Primitive accumulation, which is jumping fences and walls and climbing trees and stuff. But yes, I guess you could say it's just seizing the means of production and making the most of it.
Is
But
there
yeah.
really?
I guess the only other thing I'll say at the end of this part is, because I glossed over it a little bit, but I think he mentions that historically, back here, I think it's right at the beginning, he suggests that, where is it? Historically speaking, capital invariably first confronted landed property in the form of money, and then in the form of monetary wealth, merchant's capital and usurer's capital. So he gives us a quick look at the historical origin of capital as having origins in merchant's capital and usurer's capital. Now, at the end here, he says that, well, those all basically fit into the same formula. Because ultimately, you are starting with money and you're ending up with more money at the end. So, right, think about a merchant that buys products in one town, let's say. They spend money to buy a bunch of stuff in one town. Then they take it over to the next town and sell all those products for more than they bought them for. It's a pretty simple, trade over distance thing, and you're able to sell them for a higher price because they are maybe not as available in that area or something. So that's like a very, very simple example of a merchant that we're probably all fairly familiar with, at least. And then the other version that he mentions is the usurer, right? So this is like loans and lending. Now, I'm sure anyone even tacitly familiar with loans is familiar with interest, right? And a loan is basically giving someone money, and that with the expectation that the money will be returned with interest, which is another way of saying surplus value. You're going to give whoever lent you the money more money than you were lent. Which is, I guess, if you really boil it down, is really just M to M prime. And as far as I know, from the lender's point of view, they don't really give a shit how you come up with more money at the end. They're not worried about that. But lending can get weird. And there's also a good reason that it was considered a sin in many of the world's major religions because it's very exploitative. But that's for another time. Okay. Now we're going to talk about the contradictions in the general formula. Now, I don't know about anyone else, but the first chunk of this chapter seemed tedious to me. It's a lot more of expounding on the whole, buyer A and seller B are
no escape from the proof.
Yeah, they're sort of opposing forces, which I understand. Marx is setting up a dialectic here. So it does get a little exhausting, I will admit. And let's see. Let's cover this really fast, though. He says, thus, the inversion of the order of succession does not take us outside the sphere of simple circulation of commodities, and we must rather look to see whether this simple circulation, by its nature, might permit the valorization of the values entering into it, and consequently the formation of surplus value. So he's just saying, let's walk through a thought experiment, or just kind of think through it. Can we get surplus value purely through the simple circulation of commodities, right? Let's just think about it and assume it's possible, and we're going to see if that assumption holds water or not. And that's what the next chunk is about. So he's going to walk through a lot of exchange here, which should be sort of vaguely familiar with from the previous chapters and all that. Now, he concludes this first paragraph. He concludes it with kind of what I started with in the very beginning, right? Which is that now he's talking about exchanging corn and wine, for example. Now, he says, with reference to use values, you could say that the old adage of the exchange is a transaction which both sides gain might be true. If you're only considering the use value, right? So, I know I'm not interested. Maybe I grow corn, but maybe I don't eat it. But I'm a big wine guy. So if I go find a wine grower who has too much wine but loves corn, we can trade, and we're both going to be happy when we walk away. That's fine, but we're only happy because of the use value. But he says it's otherwise with exchange value. Now, why is that? Well, he essentially is saying that this act produces no increase of exchange value either for one or the other, because what you're exchanging are equivalents. That's kind of how exchange happens, is that you have an amount of commodities, two different commodities. Now, their amounts may vary. I'm sure we measure corn and wine in different ways and all that fun stuff. But we're not worried about how much there is. We're worried about the value of the two commodities. And remember, back to the beginning, value is socially necessary labor time. So the only reason we're able to exchange corn and wine is because we spent basically the same amount of time getting the corn and getting the wine. So he kind of throws that down. He says, nope. Let me find the little the conclusion part of this. Here we go, yeah. In its pure form, the exchange of commodities is an exchange of equivalents, and thus is not a method of increasing value. So he shuts down this first potential counter argument, right? Again, this, like Ithar keeps saying, this is part of the proof. This is the shutting down the counter arguments and all that fun stuff. So he shuts this down and says, nope. At least for this reason alone, the fact that we're exchanging equivalent amounts of value means, how could you increase it? Right? It's always, I don't know, 1 hour of work versus 1 hour work. We're not increasing at all. And he tries to explain this by saying that, the reason people get this wrong is because they're confusing use value and exchange value. I'm sure no one's ever done that before. Cough, cough. But yeah, I know it can be very easy to get lost in the weeds here, but Mark is at least trying to say that by avoiding that confusion, also avoid incorrect answers. All right. Now the next debunking. Almost fast forwarding slightly. Okay, so here's where he sets up the next potential counter argument. He says, let us therefore assume an exchange of non-equivalents. So now he's going to look in situations where, again, this is sort of like thinking it through, doing some thought experiments and all that. So he starts out by saying, imagine that for some inexplicable privilege allows the seller to sell his commodities above their value. Right? He says it's inexplicable, so basically the reason doesn't matter. But just say someone is able to sell their stuff for more than it is worth. And he says, okay, it's a markup of 10%. Okay. Now, the problem is that, sure, you sell your thing, you get a surplus value of 10. Awesome. But now you could take that 110 you just made and you want to spend it on some well-earned goods. Well, the next guy could come along and sell his stuff for 10% more also. Like, nothing's stopping him from doing that. Right? You marked up your goods by 10%, so why can't the next guy mark up his goods by 10% also? Right? Because that's what he's saying. It says the third owner now comes to him as a seller, and he also has the same privilege. So he summarizes by saying that our friend gained 10 pounds as a seller, only to lose it again as a buyer. So this counter argument that we might find, where someone says, "Oh, well, it's obvious. You just buy low, sell high, right? Duh. That's how everyone makes money." Well, that should first of all sound like a crypto pyramid scheme, rug pull, because that's probably what it is. But also, Marx is telling us that's, if everyone had to do that in order to make money, no one would make money. Right? We would just keep unendingly jacking up the prices, consistently, and then what?
You'd end up with the art world.
I mean, kind of, I guess. But yeah, if you're just jacking up prices and getting further and further away from their true value, then it's becoming more and more, the price is becoming more and more meaningless, and detached from the real values.
Anchoring core.
And but the funny thing is that they're still going to exchange at roughly the same ratio. The baseline ratios that is determined by their actual value still, remains. Even if you jack because it's basically like saying, if everything goes, it's like general inflation almost. Like, okay, it'd be a general inflation if including wages went up by the same percent, which I know is a unfortunate pipe dream for most of us. Because I don't know about y'all, but like, you had like what, a 9% inflation or something like that recently.
I think at its worst it was a little bit above 14, but I think the average was about 9.
Yeah, so let's just pretend like the average is about 9. I'm pretty sure I got like a 3% pay raise, right? So it wasn't
not even enough to keep up.
Yeah, it still was a pay cut ultimately, but let's just pretend like everything went up by 9% overnight. Then nothing would change. Only the numerical values would change, but the ratios between them would not.
Yes.
And so Marx is saying that can't explain it either. And he kind of does the same thing with the opposite, which is just saying, what if the buyer can buy cheaper? It's the same fucking thing. So he knocks down that argument. So here, I think this is where he summarizes this. The formation of surplus value and therefore the transformation of money into capital can consequently be explained neither by assuming that commodities are sold above their value, nor by assuming that they're bought at less than their value. So to summarize the counter argument here, he's saying, or his debunking of the counter argument, I should say, he's saying, yeah, this is not an explanation either. Doesn't work. It's not a good explanation. So our search continues. What is the origin of surplus value? Oops. This thing's jumping around a little bit. Let's see. Well, I guess this is one more debunking. So he says the consistent upholders of the mistaken theory that surplus value is an origin in a nominal rise of prices or in the privilege which the seller has of selling too dear, assume therefore that there must exist a class of buyers who do not sell, i.e. a class of only consumers that do not produce. The existence of such a class is inexplicable from the standpoint we have so far reached, that of simple circulation. Let us anticipate. All right, I'll just keep going. The money with which such a class is constantly making purchases, but must constantly flow into its coffers without exchange, whether by might or by right, from the pockets of the commodity owners themselves. To sell commodities at more than their value to such a class is only to get back again by swindling a part of the money previously handed over for nothing. And he gives an example here of the towns of Asia Minor paid a yearly tribute to ancient Rome, but the money Rome bought commodities from them, Rome bought commodities from them and bought them too dear, and then they flipped it around and they cheated the provincials cheated the Romans, and this way swindled back from their conquerors yet a portion of the tribute in the course of trade. And ultimately, they also got kind of screwed over because their goods were getting paid by their own money. So this is all to say that if you are trying to make money as a capitalist by screwing over other capitalists, it's not going to work because they're trying to do the same thing you are. So, because remember, capitalists are kind of almost like this hypothetical class which consumes but does not produce, right? That sounds like
complete
a
with its
capitalist.
own circular firing squad.
Right.
Just a fucking argument with my neighbor about this exact thing about people who consume without producing in regards to landlords.
Yeah. It's a very I think it was originally proposed by like Malthus. Is that what Harvey said? I want to say. But yeah, like Malthus was saying that, the aristocracy basically has basically money trees, so they can just consistently keep buying stuff like perpetually, which apparently keeps the economy afloat. That was his explanation, and it's like, okay.
It's also Malthus.
Well, that's the problem, right? It's like Malthus had no way of explaining like how they're, as Marx puts it, refilling their coffers.
I thought Malthus went into by the right of God pretty hard. Make it up.
Maybe.
It's been years
I don't
since
know.
I've touched Malthus's show. I'd need to look it up.
I don't know the details of his argument.
They're bad.
I think in the video, the David Harbour lecture, he also mentioned how that explanation that Malthus gave completely contradicted his other, arguably more infamous conclusion that like the reason poor people are poor is because they overpopulate and basically divide the spoilers.
Yeah, he was the overpopulation guy and also a huge proponent of the divine right of kings. So
yeah, I thought Malthus had some special.
So like exactly. It's like not only was he just flat out wrong, and that's I think who Marx is addressing here basically, but his theories also were self-contradictory. So it's like I don't know. I'm not sure what Malthus was smoking, but yeah, it wasn't that clever. And then where's the part? Oh, this is what I was thinking of. The capitalist class of a given country, taken as a whole, cannot defraud itself. So yeah, you can't swindle other capitalists like indefinitely, and basically because you can't have all the capitalists swindling all the other capitalists as a way of making money. That's I would guess he's boiling down Malthus' argument to that, which is crazy.
You say that, but now we have the likes of Elon Musk and whatnot.
The rebirth of Malthusian arguments, particularly among the right, are comical as they are worrying.
Yeah, that's man. I don't even know what the right language is to explain like Tesla's overvaluation in stock and shit like that. Maybe that falls under the whole fictitious capital thing. I'm not sure. Or is that just pure speculation?
Is.
I think
it's pure speculation.
It feels like pure speculation, which is like means it has very little to do with production or circulation, which is what Marx is talking about, and everything to do with gambling. It's just gambling and like collective delusion.
Casino logic.
Yeah. Because if you just replace Tesla stock with, I don't know, like landing on
NFTs.
red, like landing on red or something, right? What's the difference? Okay,
very little.
Yeah, it's like you have a billions of dollars of bets on red versus black or something. That's like, yeah, that's not much different from gambling that Tesla's going to be huge. Now, I mean, part of it is there's a little more information than like a straight gamble, but you get the picture.
There's a footnote back in chapter 4 that talks about how the MCM formula is essentially gambling, just by a different name.
Yeah, it definitely has a certain inescapability from like some amount of speculation, because you don't know for sure if that delta M is going to be positive or negative. There are ways of making it more certain that it will be positive. And that's by the way, I think that's something maybe to keep in mind, I think, for the rest of the book, is that when analyzing like why capital or capitalists do the things they do, think of it as in terms of how do you make that delta M more likely to be positive. And if you think in those terms, you can predict a lot of what capitalists are willing to do.
Would the FTX thing be like an example of capitalists trying to like swindle other capitalists?
Yes, it would.
The what?
Another in the FTX trading company one that weren't. What happened with them again? I know they got freaking hit by the FTC. I just don't remember the whole story.
That's just fraud, though, right?
They were essentially running something that looked very similar to a pyramid scheme, just with slightly different clothing.
Yeah,
so they were taking new investors' money and using it to pay off old investors.
So they were doing Bernie Madoff.
I see.
And they would take the money and like put it into their subsidiary like Alameda to do like risky stock trading, and then they would not like keep track of where any of their money was, so they kind of lost all of that when it failed, and they didn't know what was going on, and they like were really good at duping a bunch of like investors in their calls into like, you know, funding their company.
A kind of but mildly amusing thing is the guy from Curb Your Expectations, Larry, I think is the character's name, was in quite a few of FTX's commercials before it showed its true colors.
A ton of celebrities was caught up in it too.
Yeah, the whole if it looks like an MLM or pyramid scheme smells like, and somebody is promising quick riches, it's probably horseshit. But anyway, moving on. Apologies on that tangent.
That's okay. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, the shorthand I think is that if you're like essentially breaking the law and like scamming or actually swindling, yeah, that like the whole economy can't be run on swindling other capitalists. And I say that specifically because as we'll kind of see, in order to make more money, the M Prime, somebody needs to get swindled. It's just a question of who. And he gives us a hint here. It's not the capitalists that are getting swindled. Because guess what? They are the ones who keep making money. So just keep that in mind by the time we get to chapter 6, which is right after this. So I also wanted to cover this paragraph though, because I think it's a good one. All right, so he says the form MCM Prime, which is buying in order to sell dearer, is at its purest in genuine merchant's capital, but the whole of this movement takes place within the sphere of circulation. Since, however, it is impossible, by circulation alone, to explain the transformation of money into capital and the formation of surplus value, merchant's capital appears to be an impossibility, as long as equivalents are exchanged. It appears, therefore, that it can only be derived from the twofold advantage gained over both the selling and the buying producers by the merchant who parasitically inserts himself between them. It is in this sense that Franklin says war is robbery and commerce is cheating. The valorization of merchants' capital is not to be explained merely by frauds practiced on the producers of commodities. A long series of intermediate steps would be necessary, which are as yet entirely absent, since here our only assumption is that the circulation of commodities and its simple elements. So I think this paragraph is a way of saying pretty much what I was just getting at, which is that if we assume, because that's what he's saying, right? Formation of surplus value through merchant's capital appears to be impossible. But because they would have to be cheating somebody, basically, in order for that to be the case. So if I'm not mistaken, this is basically him half giving us the answer and half not giving us the answer. Right, he's giving us the answer into saying, yeah, MCM Prime is only possible when someone is cheating. But who is getting cheated? I think becomes like the next question. And he says that they are, so far, that part of the equation is absent because we're only assuming the circulation of commodities. In other words, we haven't gotten to production, right? We're not there yet. So he's, I think that paragraph, if I'm reading it right, is him basically teasing out the answer from us. I don't know if anyone else read that differently. But yeah. Okay. There's one more thing from this chapter I think it must be. Oh yeah, okay, we're at the end. Yeah. Here we go. This is the summary of chapter 5. Summary/conclusion of chapter 5, which is also very nice. I mean, seriously, like, this is another one of those, you read these few sentences, you get most of the chapter boiled down for you. He says, capital cannot, therefore, arise from circulation, and it is equally impossible for it to rise apart from circulation. It must have its origin in both circulation and not circulation. We therefore have a double result. Transformation of money into capital has to be developed on the basis of the immanent laws of the exchange of commodities in such a way that the starting point is the exchange of equivalents. The money owner, who is as yet only a capitalist in larval form, must buy his commodities at their value sell them at their value, and yet, at the end of the process, withdraw more value from circulation than he threw into it at the beginning. His emergence as a butterfly must, and yet must not, take place in the sphere of circulation. These are the conditions of the problem. So there he's wrapping up this chapter by saying, I've debunked a whole bunch of other people's explanations for how do you make money with capital? How does capital valorize itself? And where does surplus value come from? He's debunked all the other arguments, but kind of like I just mentioned, he teased out what the answer is without explicitly saying it, because he kept hinting at, well, you know, if just like he says, you know, circulation is critical for capital to be possible, right? Which is why he says it's impossible to rise apart from circulation. You can't have capital without circulation, but it's not only circulation. That's another way of saying it is a necessary condition, but it is not a sufficient condition. And that's because we haven't talked about production. And then he also teased out through his analysis that somebody's got to get fucking swindled. Somebody's got to get screwed over here. Because, like he says, that if we're buying stuff at their value and selling them at their value, we're exchanging equivalents, then we would get zero. We keep getting 0 equals 0 over and over again. But that's not what happens. So
there is no excess in a fair system.
Right, it's like somebody's got to get fucked over here. And he hasn't answered it yet, but hint, it's not the capitalist class. It's everybody else. Which is, here we go. Chapter 6. Labor power.
Dun.
So now Marx begins his answer to the question, what is surplus value and where does it come from? Okay. So let's see here. Just talking about money. That's right. I'm trying to remember what I wanted to say here. Here we go. Yeah, I'll start here. In order to extract value out of the consumption of a commodity, our friend, the money owner. Actually, let me back up a little bit here. Sorry. Let's go here instead. The change must therefore take place in the commodity which is bought in the first act of circulation, M to C, but not in its value. For it is equivalents which are being exchanged, and the commodity is paid for its full value. That was one of our assumptions. We're assuming that when you are buying commodities, you're buying them at their value. Now, the change can therefore originate only in the actual use value of the commodity, i.e. in its consumption. So in order to extract value out of the consumption of the commodity, our friend, the money owner, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in the other version he says like Mr. Moneybags or something, right?
The non-penguin one, yeah, I am pretty certain he does say Mr. Moneybags.
Yeah.
I think
Penguin
I
is
recall.
a little bit more
do like-
conservative in its German translations.
Yeah, I do like that. Mr. Moneybags, though, that's a good one. Yeah, Mr. Moneybags must be lucky enough to find within the sphere of circulation on the market a commodity whose use value possesses the peculiar property of being a source of value, whose actual consumption is therefore itself an objectification of labor, hence a creation of value. And he does find such a special commodity on the market, the capacity for labor. In other words, labor power. There's another big definition for us, and I think this one's fairly unique to Marx. He specifies the difference between labor and labor power. So labor power is the capacity to do work. And labor is more like the process of doing work, or the the use value of labor power, basically, is labor itself. Because when you use your capacity for labor, get labor. So that's the distinction, but it is kind of important. So we talked about this a little earlier in the Euro meeting, but about sort of why, like, what makes labor power as a commodity unique to capitalism? It's a good question. So Marx is going to lay out a couple of reasons why this is the case. Because he says, in order for the owner of a money can find labor power on the market as a commodity, various conditions must first be fulfilled. So, in and for itself, the exchange of commodities implies no other relations of dependence than those which result from its own nature. On this assumption, labor power can appear on the market as a commodity only if and insofar as its possessor, which is the individual whose labor power it is, offers it for sale or sells it as a commodity. Sounds super obvious, right? But basically, labor power is only a commodity if people are selling their labor power. Like pretty pretty basic reason, but if for some reason, let's say it was illegal to sell your labor power, then you would assume that people would not be doing that under threat of state violence or something. So, and to be clear, there are definitely forms of labor which are made illegal. I know, at least in the U.S., like prostitution, for example, is illegal in many, many, many places, which is a type of labor that is made illegal. So that condition would not be met, for example. Now, I know it still happens and all that fun stuff, but just an example. All right, next. It says, in order to sell it as a commodity, he must have it at his disposal, and he must be the free proprietor of his own labor capacity, hence of his person. He and the owner meet in the market and enter into relations with each other on a footing of equality as owners of commodities, with the sole difference being that one is a buyer and the other is a seller. They're both equal in the eyes of the law. So we're assuming there's a legal system that is kind of the guarantor of all these exchanges happening in the commodity market, and that law has to guarantee that buyers and sellers meet each other as equals, at least legally, and that the seller of labor power, being the person whose labor it is, they have to be free to sell their labor capacity, their labor power. So that and he goes on to say, right, that if you that specifically for labor power, you're selling it in lumps, where if you sell it once and for all, you'd be selling your whole self, which would be converting yourself to a slave, because now they own all of your labor power for the rest of time. You would, or he says, in other words, from an owner of a commodity into a commodity. So presumably you'd have to be in a situation where would not be selling yourself into slavery, like, permanently. Whether that's because it's illegal or because it's not necessary. That also has to be one of the conditions for this for labor power as a commodity. All right. Next, he says the second essential condition which allows the owner of money to find labor power in the market as a commodity is this: that the possessor of the labor power, instead of being able to sell commodities in which his labor has been objectified, must rather be compelled to offer for sale as a commodity that very labor power which exists only in his living body. So this was all one big point. Number one is you need to be able to sell your labor power as a commodity. Okay, great. The second part is that you might ask yourself, why the fuck would I do that in the first place? Right? Why would I sell my labor power to somebody else? That seems bizarre. Well, he says that it is bizarre, and basically the only reason you would do that is because you are compelled to. Basically, you have to. And he says that instead of being able to sell commodities in which his labor has been objectified, so instead of producing things on your own with your own means of production, you don't. Basically, he's going to lead into, you can't do that because you don't own the means of production. Which is what he says here. He says, in order to sell commodities other than his labor power, he must, of course, possess the means of production, such as raw materials, instruments of labor, etc. There's another big old honkin' definition for us, which everyone's a fan of, the means of production. But yeah, these are raw materials, tools, or instruments. It can also includes things like land, because most people work on land. I guess if you're on a boat, you would also need the boat as a means of production, etc., etc. So, if you do not own the means of production, or any means of production, it's going to be very hard to do any production. Big shocker, I know, but it's kind of true. So, therefore, he concludes, the only thing you can sell is your ability to use the means of production in order to make stuff. And that is your labor power. Okay, were there any comments? I heard some shuffling. I'm not sure. Okay. All right, next. This is a good little section right here, which is a nice little summary of what we just talked about. So he says, for the transformation of money into capital, therefore, the owner of money must find a free worker available on the commodity market. And this worker must be free in the double sense that as a free individual, he can dispose of his labor power as his own commodity. And that, on the other hand, he has no other commodity for sale. I.e., he is rid of them. He is free of all the other objects needed for the realization of his labor power. Which is kind of funny. Because he's saying that he's free in a double sense. He's free to sell his labor power, but he is free from the ability to use it. Mainly because he doesn't have the tools and materials to do so. Which is kind of a funny way of Marx defining freedom.
I liked how David Harvey characterized this as being the definition of freedom under capitalism.
Yeah, right.
And so that, like, when I'm going to say capitalist governments talk about freedom, that is specifically the kind of freedom that they're talking about.
Right, so if it's like, we're going to go bring freedom to that country, that means we're going to go make them all free to sell their labor and make sure they've got absolutely no means of production.
Exactly.
We're going to free up their labor so Halliburton can buy it.
Yeah. Or any of the oil companies. As in
Yeah,
recent,
Halliburton
recent
is the
examples.
first one that came to mind.
Yeah,
We're going to liberate them from their own means of production.
that's right.
Mhm.
That's such a funny way of putting it, but man, that's so true. We're gonna liberate them from their means of production. Oh, yeah. That.
So I mean, hey, in that sense, I guess the Iraq War was a war of liberation, huh?
From a certain point of view, yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You might say that's the joke.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Another nice little solid quote here. He says, "One thing is clear. Nature does not produce, on the one hand, owners of money or commodities, and on the other hand, men possessing nothing but their own labor power. This relation has no basis in natural history, nor does it have a social basis common to all periods of human history. It is clearly the result of a past historical development, product of many economic revolutions, of the extinction of a whole series of older forms of social production." So this is where he's sort of shifting gears slightly away from the kind of the argument for capital along more like logical lines and towards more of a historical argument, right? Like, how did we get here kind of question. Because you can answer how did we get here either like a logical progression or basically saying it had to happen because of these reasons. Or you can say there's also the historical dimension, which is like, how did we get here historically? And especially when you do put on the historical lens, like he does in this little mini paragraph, he says, yeah, there's nothing written in the, I don't know, in the rocks, fucking like commandments that says, this group of people are all capitalists and the rest of you are all fucking workers. Right? This isn't like some it's also, when he says natural history, I would also lump in there like it has absolutely nothing to do with genetics or ethnicity, background, none of that shit. It has everything to do with social relations and the historical development of basically human society, right? And he summarizes that by saying that it's a whole series of economic revolutions and extinctions of older forms of production. So just like in evolution, right? We can look at human beings as the products of evolution by natural selection, and with that type of theory, we know that there haven't always been human beings. No, indeed, we are the latest in a long chain of developments in the biological world. And that process of development is still happening. It's still happening all the time, just very, very, very slowly and gradually. And yeah, similarly, right, with our modes of production, or he calls it social production, right? They go through a similar type of sort of evolutionary development, if you want to think of it that way. Where you have, now, I mean, in social production, it's usually not as gradual as evolution, for example, but nor does it take as long, because usually the changes are very sudden shifts that are oftentimes violent and really kind of shake shit up real quick, and that's what we call a revolution. So, yeah, interesting that this is, I think, one of the earlier instances of this in the text of taking a historical perspective at this stuff. and viewing capital as a social relation also, and a social relation that is the latest, at least when he's writing, right? It's the newest form of social production, but it's not the first, it's not the last, it's just the latest one, right? And I think that's, for some reason, not widely accepted amongst, like, especially liberals, right? They have the whole end of history argument. It's never going to get better than this, or worse. Yeah, I think basically proponents of capitalism are often like stuck in that capitalist realist illusion of like, well, capitalism is here and it's here to stay forever, and it's been here forever. That is just very ahistorical, to be honest. What's next? Okay, so he's walking. I'm just trying to refresh my memory here. Okay. Okay, yeah. So he's saying, towards the end of this paragraph, we know by experience that a relatively feeble development of commodity circulation suffices for the creation of all these forms. But he says it's otherwise with capital. The historical conditions of its existence are by no means given with the mere circulation of money and commodities. So just put a pin in that real quick, right? So just having the circulation of money and commodities is not enough of a, like before, I think another way of putting this would say that it is necessary, but not sufficient. And we kind of talked about this a little earlier in the Euro one, especially with regards to wage labor. In other words, selling labor power in exchange for money. And what we concluded is, like, you know, it's wage labor is fairly old. I think you could probably suggest that it has been around a very long time, much longer than capital has been around. Right. In other words, working for someone else for some money, like that social relation is pretty old school. Even in like ancient slave-based economies or societies, it's not hard to imagine like certain very, potentially there's laborers that had like maybe a high degree of skill or like a unique skill set or something, and they may be free to sell their services to different clients, for example, right? It's not impossible to imagine. And we shouldn't just say, it'd also be rather incorrect to say that at any point in history that the totality of an entire society's economy was all, one form of production or one mode of production, right? So we can look at feudal society and say the reason we call this a feudal system is because the overwhelming majority of the, production in this society follows the feudal, arrangement. But it would be incorrect to say that it was the only form, or the only mode of production, because we all know that in the feudal system they still had slavery. I mean, shit, America still had slavery well into their capitalist development, and then you had a civil war between the two modes of production. So it's very much possible for components of different or basically for different modes of production to share like elements or share characteristics, right? For example, you can have circulation of money in lots of different organizations. You could also even have commodities in multiple organizations. So just those two things isolated by themselves does not mean you have capitalism necessarily. So let's continue then. It, meaning capital, arises only when the owner of the means of production and subsistence finds the free worker available on the market as the seller of his own labor power, and this one historical precondition comprises a world's history. Capital therefore announces from the outset a new epoch in the process of social production. So specifically, once you have money and commodities, you also need to get to this point where you have free workers that are out there in the streets trying to sell their labor power to people who have money, which means the capitalists. So another way of putting this is that the system of wage labor is a prerequisite for capital. And that's sort of setting up, switch tabs here, this last bubble in the chain of this path of argument that David Harvey sets up. But we're beginning to see the foundation here of this dichotomy between capital and labor. Labor specifically like wage labor, right? So one basically necessitates the other, right? You need wage labor in order for there to be capital, and wage labor would only exist because you have capital, and specifically a lot of the social relations that make capital possible, specifically private property, as we'll probably get to later. All right. What else here? So I think the next couple bits here are... Oh, I hear the old man snoring again. Turn him down slightly. Yeah. Hey, he made it much longer this time. Kudos. So a couple paragraphs here about the value of labor power. Now, I do remember going over this in Wage, Labor, and Capital, like way the fuck back when. But the very quick summary of that is that, like any commodity, its value is the socially necessary labor time to produce it. Big shocker. Now, you might ask, well, okay, but labor power is just the capacity for a human being to do labor, so what's that all about? Well, simply put, the amount of socially necessary labor it takes to keep the worker alive and able to do work is another way of saying its cost of production. So, and he also adds in not just production, but also reproduction. So, as he puts somewhere in here, yeah, the owner of labor power is mortal. So, not only do you have to keep your workers alive, you need to give them enough resources in order to keep them alive and able to procreate, produce more workers for when they die. And I think, I'm sure this will come up later in the text if I had to guess, but the question, and this is, David Harvey does a good job of explaining this in the video, but basically the struggle over like what should be that, as he puts it, a bundle of commodities, or the basket of commodities that is considered this minimum, like a minimum wage is another way of putting it. because the minimum wage basically is just another way of saying the price of the bundle of commodities in order to keep your workers alive and able to work. That is basically what the minimum wage is. Now, obviously, in the process of class struggle, right here, capital versus labor, see, class struggle. Class struggle has a lot to do with that struggle over what the definition of the minimum wage should be. That's not the only thing that class struggle determines, but it is a large determinant in it. So I'm sure that'll come up later in the text if I had to guess, because I just don't know how soon.
I mean, he does point out to a degree that as history progresses and as society progresses, that sort of minimum tends to increase because people have an expectation of like a minimum standard of living that increases as things like technology and sanitation and things like that improve.
Yeah.
And I kind of made a note on that essentially the inverse of that is that if you can convince workers that they can live with less, you might be able to get away with compensating them less. And that kind of comes back to like where weren't they talking about that on the most recent episode of the Deprogram with advertising and showing like different types of standards of living and like glamorizing things like van life or living
Don't
in an
spoil
RV.
too much. I haven't watched this yet.
All right, yeah, no, I mean, it's kind of a minor point that they made, and then I immediately read this probably 45 minutes later. So I was like, wait a second. I see the inverse here.
You're also hinting at a large, glaring contradiction there, right? That on the one hand, you have the advertisers saying you should buy all these things that you don't really need, but they're trying to convince you. Yeah, they're trying to convince you to consume all the shit that you don't need. And yet, on the other hand, and you see conservatives do this shit all the fucking time, because they're more guilty of it than at least the liberals are, but right, it's always the no avocado toast, no iPhone, blah blah blah. Like basically,
be happy living in a cardboard box on the side of the street, you
right.
peasant.
They're basically saying, no, you're not. It's not that you're being underpaid. It's that you are buying too many things with your wage, right? Tisk. You shouldn't be. You're buying more than your allotted, like allowance, basically.
Yeah, didn't Fox News like bitch that like 60% of American households had a microwave or something?
No, it was
the
something that like
poverty
the refrigerator
commercial thing.
No, it's the fridge. Okay, I thought it was a microwave.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
God
no,
forbid
there was this.
You have a fridge.
They because like if you get the like expanded census form, it asks you all kinds of like I think it's like the American Community Survey or something, and it asks you all sorts of things about like, does your house have running water? Do you have a refrigerator? Do you have central AC?
Washer and dryer, etc.
Yeah, I think and what they're trying to kind of get at is like a baseline of like what most households have and kind of what your baseline standard of living should be. And I'm wanting to say it was like with the 2010 census that they found that even if you were below the poverty line, it was something like 90% or more of households had a refrigerator. And Fox News lost their entire shit because apparently to them, if you're poor, you don't have, I guess, a fridge or a microwave or maybe electricity.
Yeah, eat nothing but soup you can't, or eat nothing but canned soup, you peasants.
Yeah, I mean, it was
soup and crackers.
And like absolutely there is a level of poor in which you have a roof over your head but you have like literally no amenities, but that's really the exception rather than the rule in this day and age. And that's to a degree what Marx is getting at when he's talking about how as society progresses that minimum increases.
Yeah, and this is sort of what we're discussing right now, is that one of the most profound contradictions of capital, which is the contradiction between production and realization of commodities, or especially surplus value. So, right, on the one hand, you are required to underpay your workers, which I know, quote unquote, spoiling it, but shocker, yes, that is going to happen in this book. We're going to get there, but indeed, on the productive side of things, right, capitalists want to make sure that they're not paying workers the full value of their labor. But on the other hand, those workers are oftentimes the consumers of the very products you need to sell in order to make the profit. But if you underpay them, they don't have enough money to spend. And you know, this is where you have the analogy of the snake eating its own ass, because it is a self-destructive cycle, and that's why the economy crashes like clockwork.
And then, kind of continuing the logic in, the discussion of paying your workers enough to, afford to reproduce. There's kind of a whole other demographic freakout that OMG, millennials and Gen Z aren't having kids because really, who the fuck can afford it? Like, kids are expensive, and it's hard enough to support like one person, with
Right.
what the average, even with like the average or median income, I guess, which is like, what is that now? Like 55K in the US or something like that, which is not a lot. Like, you could probably afford to live on canned soup in most large cities on that, and that's about it if you live in a van.
Yeah, I'd take that. That's about 25 more K than I make.
Yeah. But like, when your rent is, shoot, like what's like the median 2-bedroom rent these days? I think it's cracked $1,000 even if you look at the entire country.
I don't even know.
It's like I know that yeah. I mean, it's like I know that nowhere in the country can you afford rent on a 2-bedroom home or apartment on minimum wage, regardless of whatever the local minimum wage is. So, I mean, regardless, it really is starting to look like capitalists have not particularly found the correct wage to both ensure that the worker can still come to work and that they will eventually replace themselves.
Yeah. So, like I just hinted at, right, the whole contradiction between production and realization, Marx is going to lead us away from realization for now, away from sphere of circulation, and into the productive sphere. So he says, let us therefore, in company with the Mr. Moneybags and the worker, leave this noisy sphere, where everything takes place on the surface and in full view of everyone, and follow them into the hidden abode of production, on whose threshold there hangs the notice, no admittance except on business. Here we shall see not only how capital produces, but how capital is itself produced. The secret of profit-making must at last be laid bare. So at last he at least tells us where we need to look to get our answers. We need to go to the productive sphere of things, where commodities are made, in order to discover more about capital, where it comes from. Let's see. He says, okay, so he's laying out some innate rights of man. So he says there's freedom, because the buyers and sellers are, quote unquote, meeting upon their own free will. So a lot of this, I guess I won't go through the whole thing, but I think what he's doing in this paragraph is he's entering the productive sphere, like he said, but he's not going to totally go on his own tangent, basically. I think what he's doing here in the beginning is saying that I am accepting the fundamental assumptions of the classical political economists, right? Because I think we hear this a lot, even from modern liberals, where they're like, oh, well, for example, how could anyone be exploited if they both have free will and, like, they're freely able to determine their own actions, right?
Yeah, and the earlier one we touched into this, where it basically hits to the participation is in theory voluntary, but as far in reality, it is you either participate or you die.
Exactly, and I think Marx is laying out the ground rules, basically.
I'm sure
Right,
that most
so-
workers would find that starvation on the street is very much a motivating factor of, taking a job.
But hey, you are free to starve.
But technically, yes, you do have that freedom to just die on the street corner.
Harvey kind of says and heavily implies that the entirety of chapter 6 should be prefaced with the supposed perfectly functioning market economy. Very much in the
Right.
sort of assume a spherical cow.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, and so he says,
So based on that assumption, then he kind of comes back to that where, again, like where he's laying out the freedom, equality, property in Bentham.
yeah, so that's basically this
and that
paragraph.
and that entire bit is just dripping with irony, because in the absolute next paragraph, the last paragraph of chapter 6 is basically the oh shit moment in the book, I think, or at least the book so far.
Yeah. Right. So he tells us where he's going. He's going into the productive sphere. He tells us the ground rules, which he's basically borrowing from the classical political economists. He's like, yep, everyone's a free agent here, right? There's no there's no like coercion at the point of a gun, kind of. Again, we just made fun of that, but yes, he's tongue-in-cheek saying that everyone's a free person here. They're free before the law. I think that is maybe the quote-unquote politically correct way of putting it. He says that there's equality, which is another very tongue-in-cheek way of putting it, because they are interrelations with another, and as with the simple owner of commodities, they exchange equivalent for equivalent. So, again, that was a little tongue-in-cheek, I think, or at least we'll see why that's the case, but he's saying, let's just pretend like they're meeting each other's equals. Okay. We're following the rules of property, because they are only disposing of what is that which they own, and Bentham, because each looks only to his own advantage. And the only force bringing them together and putting them into relation with each other is the selfishness, the gain, and the private interests of each. So this is the classic assumption in political economy, which is like everyone's a perfectly rationally self-interested, right? So everyone's going to act in the most optimal way of getting what they want. Think of it that way. All right, and then, let's just go through the final paragraph because it is pretty sick. When we leave the sphere of simple circulation or exchange of commodities, which provides the free trader vulgaris, with his views, his concepts, and the standard by which he judges the society of capital and wage labor, there's that dichotomy, a certain change takes place, or so it appears, in the physiognomy, I think almost physiognomy. I don't know if I'm saying that's nomi, right? Physiognomy. Yeah.
Don't worry, it's a dead language.
I know. I mean, this is in English. It's just not a common word.
That's what I said, a dead language.
Oh, English? Yeah, I guess so. Of our dramatis personae. He was previously the Mr. Moneybags, now strides out in front as a capitalist. Possessor of labor power follows as his worker. The one smirks self-importantly and is intent on business. The other is timid and holds back, like someone who has brought his own hide to market and now has nothing else to expect but a tanning.
Physiognomy is the study of facial features.
Ah, okay.
Or, hang on. 1, facial features. 2, the art of judging human character from facial features. And 3, divination based on facial features.
Okay.
Okay, that tracks with that tracks with the previous use of his word appears.
Yeah. And dramatis personae is like what? Let me check the footnotes.
That's kind of your he uses that a couple of times to kind of like your kind of character or your caricature of your players within this little situation he's laying out.
Oh, there isn't a footnote for that one.
He uses
I know
it a couple of times.
He's used it before. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's I mean it's kind of it's a literary term that essentially is like an archetype. I think,
I kind of get what it means too.
Yeah,
I get it because it's sort of like it's like when someone says, put your put your most polite act on, basically. For example, right? Like act natural, or like act polite or something.
Yeah. But like he uses it in this sense, and he's used it in the text previously to kind of basically basically a way to talk about like the archetypes of the seller and the buyer and the capitalist and the worker, and you're kind of looking at those as an archetype or as like a character within
like
this sort of Greek play.
Yeah,
right.
Like roles in a play. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. That makes more sense then.
Looking at it a very kind of Greek drama sort of sense. Marx really does love his literary things.
Indeed. All right, well that is the beginning and end of part 2. That's all. They knocked that out in one sitting, which is cool. So like he said, next time we will be getting into the productive sphere, and we're going to learn about the production of absolute surplus value. So even though we got some answers, we mostly got like non-answers, right? We got answers that aren't really answers. They're basically saying, it's not this, it's not that. Nope, not that thing either. We are hopefully going to get some more legit answers next time. And let's see, what's the actual batch of chapters? I think it's 7 through 9 is on the schedule. Yep, 7 through 9 is the next group. So, yeah. Let me build the recording there.